isso que foi colocado aqui pelo Perina, e talvez a reflexão que a gente tenha que fazer nesse debate é como nós podemos adaptar esse modelo, ou como outras regiões do mundo podem também se beneficiar desse modelo, né? E o que a gente teria que fazer? Eu acho que é uma reflexão que eu gostaria que o Perina trouxesse. Se vale só para o Brasil, ou o pessoal fala o Brasil é um case separado do mundo e não vai ser aplicado para outras regiões. Eu queria que o Perina me dissesse o que a gente teria que fazer, ou quais outros países, outras situações que pudessem estar adaptando esse modelo, e esse modelo que poderia conciliar a produção de alimento e combustível. Uma outra pergunta, outra reflexão que eu queria que o Perina trouxesse e apresentasse alguns números que ele não apresentou aqui é qual a área em rotação de cultura efetiva na cana hoje. Hoje nós temos 7 milhões de hectares. Quanto dessa área, efetivamente, nós fazemos rotação de cultura, né? E outra reflexão que eu gostaria é como você conciliar os modelos operacionais, né, que você falou que nós temos a infraestrutura, mas como você fazer isso operacionalmente, que é um grande desafio, e aonde entra a discussão das pastagens, né? Como eu sei que tem vários trabalhos sendo realizados com aumento de produtividade de pastagens, e talvez o trabalho pastagem, alimento, cana, o que vocês estão vendo como essa alternativa, já que a cana cresceu 800 mil hectares praticamente em cima de pastagens nos últimos anos, como que nós vamos resolver isso também? Então, algumas reflexões que eu deixo para o Perina trazer para o debate com os senhores. The next speaker is Ron Litterer. He's the president of National Corn Growers Association in the U.S. He got his undergraduate degree from Iowa State University. He has been a member of different boards and has been working with National Research Board in the U.S., as well as USDA. So it's a pleasure to have Ron here with us, which represents the other side, I would say, an important partner for Brazil, especially in terms of production of ethanol. I'm sure that Ron will bring us and will gave us a lot of information and data about the future trends of corn's growth in the U.S. and how they are facing also this debate on the impacts of the bioethanol program in the U.S. In the food prices, especially.
Well, I too would like to thank UNICA for the opportunity to visit about this issue, the food and fuel issue that we have faced the last year. I think there's a lot of similarities in what Ismael talked about with sugarcane production and corn production in the U.S. In other words, the productivity increases are becoming even greater, and I think we have a lot of similarities in our two crops. I'd also like to say, though, that I think the issue of food and the debate that we've had in the past year is not immune to Brazil. It is been a very big topic in the United States, but I think it's also very important to Brazil and other countries around the world. And we have to address this in a very positive and truthful manner, because food production is such a vital interest to people around the world. I would like to sort of back up. If you recall, most of this issue began about 1 year ago, or a little over a year ago, when we had a huge increase in wheat prices, especially hard red wheat in the United States, when wheat prices went to over $25 a bushel. And then we came into the rice issue, which was an issue of shortages and hoarding of rice around the world. And of course, those of you that know anything about rice production, those acres usually are not interchangeable with sugarcane or corn. So it's totally separate issues. And then we got into what I call the commodity speculative bubble that happened about a year ago, where all commodities took dramatic increases in prices, and not just grains, but metals and energy commodities in particular. And so those dramatic increases in prices gave those that oppose biofuels an opening to try to provide a wedge for going forward with biofuels. And I think as we look back over history, of the last year, we see that a lot of those questions have been answered. Okay. Well, first of all, in summary, what I'd like to point out is, as a corn production, we are meeting the needs of all of our end users. We are growing more corn on fewer acres, very similar to what the sugarcane message was. Corn prices are down about 50% from their highs of 1 year ago, and average corn prices appear to be stabilizing. And also, a very important point for ethanol production from starch corn is that about 1/3 of the corn used in ethanol production comes back as a high-protein livestock feed. We call them distillers' grains. And that is a very important component that is usually lost in this discussion. Just to give you a little bit of information on corn supply for 2008-2009, we planted about 86 million acres of corn. We've harvested about 12.1 billion bushels of corn. Our yield, trendline yield, is about 154 last year. And we have carried over about 1.6 billion bushels of supply or stocks into the next year. So it means our total corn supply was 13.7 billion bushels. Here's how we split up our use of ethanol, or of corn production. Ethanol is, as you see, the 3.8 billion bushel category. That includes the DDGs as well, coming out of there. 5.4 is still going into feed, which is still our major, most important market. And then, of course, exports, and then we have a carry-out supply, and then, of course, some food uses as well. If you look back over the last 3 years, we have seen our acres from 2 years ago at sort of the recent high at 93.5 million acres. This past year, it was 86 million, and projections for this growing year are in the neighborhood of 85 million acres. So they're coming down a little bit because of our adequate supply of corn and our good production. Corn harvested 2 years ago was over 13 billion bushels, and again projecting about 12.1 billion bushels for this year. If you look at corn for ethanol, that is our growth market, and that is why it's very important for us to have increased productivity and yields per acre to meet this growing market. We'll be using about over 4 billion bushels of corn for ethanol production. An average price on an annual average price is stabilizing in that $4.20 per bushel range. So how does ethanol impact the price of field corn and the price of food in the market? And that was a fundamental question that we had to answer this past year. The Congressional Budget Office just released a study not too long ago. Is very important, and I think it sent a very positive message to the biofuels expansion around the world, is don't blame corn for the recent run-up in food prices. In fact, corn did have some impact because of the biofuel expansion, but it represented only about 10 to 15% of the recent rise in food prices. That the majority of those costs were really driven from energy costs, transportation costs of food, labor costs, those kind of costs that go into food production. In fact, roughly 19 to 20% of the total food dollar actually goes back to the farm gate or to farmers. The other report that was very important, one of the first reports that actually came out to address this issue was from the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. They did an analysis, and they basically said the same thing, that very small percent, about 10% of the corn price had an effect on food prices. Another report that was done as well, they're saying that in 1959, 59% due primarily to the labor and energy. Today it's 80%. The cost of food is because of labor and energy cost. Another study was done by Texas A&M University, and they said that the higher corn prices have very little impact on consumer food prices, and that higher energy prices were viewed as the underlying force driving the economic change that we saw in the past year. And then this was a private economist that did an analysis, and he's saying that a per gallon increase in the price of gas has 3 times the effect on food prices, as does a $1 increase per bushel in the price of corn. So again, a lot of studies that verified that even though corn had some impact, it was very minimal at best. And now that energy prices have moderated somewhat, there have been some food prices coming back down, but others are a little slow to come down. This graph points out what we saw happen in the last year. If you look at the peak right here, that was about 1 year ago. That's when the commodity prices really peaked. We actually had another issue that in the United States that maybe exacerbated the concern about the food price issue, and that was the flooding that we had in the Midwest. And you actually see that corn prices for a relatively short time actually went above the oil price, crude oil spot price, but have come back to a more traditional range since then. The flooding impact was not nearly as severe on production as you saw with our 12 billion bushel crop last year as the media portrayed it. There's a lot of, when you have an event like that, a natural disaster, the media can maybe overplay the effect that was going to have on the corn production. So the media is finally catching on to this. I think this is an important thing. The media sort of led this charge without really thinking it through, but they are catching on. They are now admitting that really it wasn't the biofuels that caused the impact, the higher impact, the major higher impact on food production. And they are really looking at some of the food manufacturers who have raised their prices dramatically during the time and questioning why those prices maybe are not coming back in line with some of the lower energy cost. For example, Kraft raised its wholesale price of a box of macaroni and cheese an average of 9% last year, and despite a 38 to 68% plunge in cheese and wheat prices. So we know there's a lag time for grocers, manufacturers, to work through their cost and bring them back in line, but quite honestly, we think they maybe should have come down a little quicker than what they have. The other point that I think, again, especially to those of you with sugarcane ethanol, is that with grain-based or starch-based ethanol, a very important component of this is what we call distillers' grains, and about a third of a bushel of corn comes back out as a high-protein feed. And I mentioned this before, but I think it gets lost in this thing because you are not taking all the grain and using it for ethanol. You're using about 2/3 of it, and a third of it's coming back as a livestock feed. A wet mill process, which is a little different, it takes the oil out, and so you're getting a corn gluten. You don't get quite as much of the feed value back because they're taking some of the energy out in the oil, which is different than the dry mill process, which has been the recent expansion we've had in the U.S. has mostly been dry mill production of ethanol. So there's a little difference in those feed components, but really the concept is very similar. There's still a lot that comes back for livestock feed. Again, this is just a graph to show you that if you look at corn use for ethanol, using the left axis, you can see that we've gone, in the last few years, we've had an increase from a little over 2